A homeless boy braves the flames to rescue the millionaire farmer's daughter, and the reward he demands is simply unbelievable. Dawn had barely broken when a small figure slipped out of the old, abandoned barn. Jean, only 6 years old, rubbed his sleepy eyes and adjusted the worn-out backpack on his skinny shoulders. Beside him, Max, a scruffy-haired mutt, wagged his tail faithfully. The boy looked toward the horizon where the imposing Miller mansion rose against the pinkish sky. His eyes, far too large for his pale, gaunt face, shone with a mixture of curiosity and resignation. With an almost imperceptible sigh, he turned and began his daily journey. Jean walked with light, almost soundless steps, the result of years spent avoiding attention. His bare feet knew every rock and branch along the path. Max followed closely, sometimes running ahead to sniff at something interesting, but always returning to the boy's side. When they reached the edge of the road, Jean stopped and observed carefully. His eyes scanned the asphalt, searching for the telltale glint of cans or the flutter of papers in the wind. With a cat-like agility, he jumped onto the shoulder and began his collection. His small, calloused hands worked quickly, picking up crushed cans and pieces of cardboard. Each item was carefully examined before being placed in his backpack. Jean knew exactly what was valuable and what was useless. As he worked, his mind wandered. He remembered a time not so long ago when his hands were soft and clean, when he held not cans, but the warm fingers of his mother, Claire. "Jean, my little one," Claire's voice echoed in his memory. "Always remember that you are stronger than you think and smarter than you believe." The boy shook his head, pushing the memory away. There was no time for that now. The sun was already high, and he needed to finish his collection before the heat became unbearable. Hours passed, and Jean's backpack grew heavier by the minute. Max, always alert, occasionally barked to warn the boy about cars that came too close. Jean smiled gratefully at his loyal companion, offering him a piece of stale bread he had saved from the previous day. When the sun reached its peak, Jean decided it was time to head back. His stomach growled, but he ignored the hunger. He had learned long ago how to deal with it. On the way back, they passed by the entrance to the Miller estate. Jean paused for a moment, observing the long driveway that led to the mansion. He saw a luxurious car leaving through the gates and quickly hid behind a tree. From his hiding place, Jean saw a man in a suit getting out of the car, talking on the phone with a serious expression. It was Robert Miller, the owner of the estate. Jean watched him with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. As the man entered the house, Jean noticed movement in one of the second-floor windows. A small girl, perhaps his own age, was looking out with a sad expression. For a brief moment, their gazes met, and Jean felt a strange connection. Shaking his head to clear those thoughts, Jean continued on his way. There was no room for dreams in his life. He had responsibilities. He had to survive. Back in the barn, Jean began to organize the day's collection. Carefully, he separated the cans by type, stacked the cardboard, and saved anything that could be useful. His eyes shone with concentration as he worked, his hands moving with the precision of someone much older. Max settled into a corner, watching Jean with attentive eyes. The boy smiled at his furry friend, grateful for the silent company. When he finished organizing everything, Jean pulled an old newspaper clipping from his backpack. He sat on a bale of hay and began to read, his lips moving silently as he deciphered the words. "Look, Jean." His mother's voice sounded again in his memory. "Each word is a window to a new world, to a new. Never stop learning, my love." Jean swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. He couldn't cry. Crying was for the weak, and he needed to be strong. As the afternoon wore on, Jean went out again, this time to sell his findings. He knew well the places where he could trade cans and cardboard for a few coins. Every penny was precious, carefully guarded in a small cloth pouch hidden in his backpack. On the way back, he passed by a bakery. The smell of fresh bread made his stomach growl painfully. For a moment, Jean considered using some of his coins to buy a piece, but he quickly dismissed the idea. He needed to save every penny. Instead, Jean headed to a small brook on the backside of the Miller property. There, far from prying eyes, he and Max could drink fresh water, and Jean washed his face and hands, watching the day's dirt being carried away by the current. While drying his hands on his tattered shirt, Jean heard voices approaching. Quickly, he and Max hid behind some bushes. Two farm workers passed by, talking animatedly. "Did you hear? Little Charlotte is sick again," said one of them. "Poor thing," replied the other. "They say it's asthma. Mr. Miller has been worried." Jean frowned, remembering the girl he had seen in the window. Something tightened in his chest at the thought of her being sick and alone in that big mansion. When the men moved on, Jean emerged from his hiding place, pensive. He looked toward the mansion, then at Max, who regarded him with understanding eyes. "Come on, Max," Jean said softly. "It's getting late." The two returned to the barn as the sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink. Jean prepared a small fire, carefully controlled so as not to draw attention. He shared his meager dinner with Max, a piece of stale bread and a few scraps he had managed to find. Before sleeping, Jean took a small, worn-out book from his backpack, the only one he owned, a gift from his mother. By the weak light of the fire, he read a few pages, his eyes shining with fascination for the stories and knowledge contained within. Finally, with the book safely back in his backpack, Jean settled down in the hay. Max curled up beside him for warmth. He looked up at the barn's roof, where he could see a few stars through the cracks. "Good night, Mom," he whispered to the starry sky, a single tear escaping before sleep claimed him. And so ended another day in the life of little Jean, a boy who, despite his tender age, carried the weight of the world on his small shoulders. A boy who, unbeknownst to him, was about to change not only his own life, but the lives of everyone around him. The morning sun filtered through the silk curtains of Charlotte's room, illuminating the golden curls spread across the pillow. The 4-year-old girl opened her eyes slowly, her small chest rising and falling in an uneven rhythm. Beside the bed, an inhaler rested on the nightstand, a constant presence in her life. Charlotte sat up, her blue eyes scanning the vast bedroom filled with untouched toys. Porcelain dolls stared at her with glassy eyes from shelves too high for her to reach. An electric train set, a gift from her last birthday, remained in its box, never assembled. "Miss Charlotte," came the gentle voice of Anne, the housekeeper, from the other side of the door. "It's time to get up, dear." The door opened, revealing Anne, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile and kind eyes. She approached the bed, helping Charlotte to her feet. "How are you feeling today, sweetheart?" Anne asked, placing a hand on the girl's forehead. Charlotte shrugged, a gesture far too mature for her 4 years. "Where's Daddy?" she asked, her small voice filled with hope. Anne's smile faltered for a moment. "Your father had to leave early for an important meeting, dear, but I'm sure he'll come see you later." Charlotte nodded, accustomed to that answer. While Anne helped her get dressed, the girl looked out the window, watching the estate workers begin their day. Her gaze lingered on a family passing along the distant road, a father, a mother, and 2 children laughing and playing together. After breakfast, which Charlotte barely touched, Anne took her to the garden. The fresh morning air made the girl cough lightly, and Anne immediately grabbed the inhaler. "Just in case," she said with an encouraging smile, helping Charlotte use the device. Charlotte sat on an ornate bench, watching butterflies dance among the flowers. Anne busied herself watering nearby plants, keeping a watchful eye on the girl. "Anne," Charlotte called after a while, "why can't I go to school like the other children?" The housekeeper approached, sitting beside the girl. "Oh, darling, you know your health is delicate. Your father wants to make sure you're safe and well cared for here at home." Charlotte frowned, her small hands tightening in her lap. "But I feel lonely," she whispered. Anne hugged the girl, her heart breaking at the sadness in her voice. "I know, my dear. How about we read a story together? You can pick the book." As the two headed back into the house, Charlotte stopped, her eyes fixed on something beyond the estate's fence. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a boy and a dog watching her, but when she blinked, they were gone. In the afternoon, the sound of a car entering the property made Charlotte's heart race. She ran to the window, seeing her father, Robert Miller, getting out of his luxurious car. "Daddy!" she cried, rushing downstairs, ignoring Anne's warnings not to overexert herself. Robert entered the house, phone glued to his ear. He raised a hand in a distracted greeting to Charlotte, still talking as he walked toward his office. No, the numbers aren't good enough. We need to review the entire strategy." His voice trailed off as the office door closed behind him. Charlotte stood in the middle of the hall, her small hands clenched at her sides, unshed tears glistening in her eyes. Anne came over, placing a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "Come, dear. How about we prepare a special snack? Maybe your father can join us later." The hours passed slowly. Charlotte sat in the living room, absently flipping through a picture book. From time to time, she glanced at the office door, hoping it would open. Finally, as night began to fall, Robert emerged from his sanctuary. He looked tired, worry lines etched into his features. "Charlotte," he said, noticing his daughter, "you're still awake." The girl ran to him, hugging his legs. Robert hesitated for a moment before awkwardly patting her hair. "How are you feeling? Any trouble breathing today?" he asked, his voice a blend of concern and distraction. Charlotte shook her head. "I'm fine, Daddy. Would you like to see the drawing I made?" Robert glanced at his watch, frowning. "Maybe tomorrow, sweetheart. I still have a lot of work to do. Be a good girl and go to bed, okay?" Before Charlotte could protest, Robert's phone rang again. With a sigh, he answered it, heading back to his office. Charlotte watched the door close once more, her small frame seeming to wilt. Anne appeared, gently guiding Charlotte upstairs. "Come along. It's time for your bath and to get ready for bed." Later, lying in her bed that was far too big, Charlotte looked out the window. The full moon lit up the garden, creating dancing shadows. For a moment, she thought she saw the boy and the dog again, this time near the old barn. Charlotte blinked, and the vision vanished. Maybe it was just her imagination, conjuring the friends she so desperately wished for. With a sigh, she turned over in bed, hugging her favorite teddy bear. "Good night, Mommy," she whispered to the portrait on her bedside table. A beautiful woman with the same golden hair as Charlotte, smiling radiantly. Outside, hidden in the shadows of the barn, Jean watched the lit window. He didn't know why he felt so drawn to that lonely girl, so different from him yet strangely familiar. Max sniffed beside him, and Jean patted the dog's head. "Come on, buddy," he murmured. "It's time to sleep." As the two retreated to their makeshift shelter, Jean cast one last glance at the mansion. For a brief moment, two lonely souls, one surrounded by luxury, the other by poverty, were united by a shared longing, the simple desire for connection and friendship. The dusk sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, while the day's heat slowly faded. The Miller mansion loomed against the horizon, its windows reflecting the last rays of the setting sun. In the air lingered a deceptive calm, as though nature itself were holding its breath, awaiting what was to come. Inside the house, Anne moved efficiently, preparing Charlotte's dinner. The little girl played quietly with her dolls in the living room, casting occasional glances toward her father's closed office door. "Charlotte, dear," Anne called, placing a steaming bowl of soup on the table. "Come have dinner." The little girl approached the table, her blue eyes searching the empty space beside her. "Daddy's not having dinner with me again today?" Anne sighed, stroking the child's golden hair. "Your father is very busy, my love. He has an important meeting tonight." As if on cue, the office door opened and Robert Miller stepped out, adjusting his tie. He barely looked at his daughter as he hurried across the room. "Anne, I'm going into the city. I have a dinner with some investors. Don't wait up," he said, already reaching for the door handle. "Daddy?" Charlotte's small voice made him pause for a moment. "Can you give me a goodnight kiss when you get back?" Robert hesitated, finally looking at his daughter. For a brief moment, something like guilt passed through his eyes. "Sure, Princess. Now be a good girl and do what Anne says, okay?" Before Charlotte could respond, he was already gone, the sound of his car's engine breaking the night silence. Anne noted Charlotte's dejected expression. "Come, dear. Let's have dinner, and then we can read a story before bed." The hours dragged on. Charlotte played a bit longer, took her bath, and listened attentively as Anne read to her. Finally, with the girl nestled in her bed, Anne glanced at the clock. "Charlotte, I need to run into town for some last-minute shopping. Will you be okay on your own for a bit? I promise I won't be long." Charlotte nodded bravely, though her eyes betrayed a hint of apprehension. "I'll be fine, Anne. I'm a big girl now." Anne smiled, kissing the child's forehead. "That's right. Sleep well, my angel. I'll be back before you know it." With one last look at Charlotte, Anne left and closing the door gently behind her. The ensuing silence was almost tangible. Charlotte curled up under the covers, hugging her favorite teddy bear. Outside, the wind began to blow, making the trees whisper in an almost ghostly manner. Meanwhile, at the back of the property, Jean paced restlessly. The unseasonable heat made the old barn stifling, so he and Max had gone out in search of fresh air. The boy looked at the lit mansion, noticing that only one window upstairs was still illuminated. Suddenly, a strange smell reached Jean's nostrils. He frowned, trying to identify it. It was acrid, reminiscent of burning plastic. Inside the mansion, completely unaware of the danger, Charlotte had finally dozed off, lulled by exhaustion and loneliness. It was the soft crackling that woke her first. Charlotte opened her eyes, confused. An odd odor filled the air, and she could see a thin haze near the ceiling. "Anne!" she called, her voice trembling. There was no answer. Fear began to take hold of her chest when she noticed an orange glow from under her bedroom door. The crackling grew louder, accompanied by pops and creaks. Charlotte jumped out of bed, running for the door. Touching the handle, she screamed and pulled back. The metal was scalding hot. "Daddy!" she yelled, tears streaming down her face. "Anne, someone, please!" The fire, sparked by faulty wiring in the old mansion, now spread voraciously across the second floor. Flames licked the walls, devouring the antique wallpaper and luxurious carpets. Charlotte ran to the window, coughing as the smoke thickened. She could see the flames reflected in the glass, relentlessly advancing toward her. "Help!" she screamed, her voice weak and hoarse. "Please, someone help me!" Outside, Jean froze at the distant sound of her cry. His eyes widened at the sight of black smoke billowing from the mansion, the flames now visible through the second-floor windows. "Max, come on!" he shouted, running toward the burning house. Jean's heart pounded furiously in his chest. He knew he should run, hide, stay out of trouble. But something inside him pushed him forward. The image of the lonely girl he had watched from afar flickered in his mind. As he ran, memories of his own mother flooded his thoughts, her fearful eyes when fire consumed their small apartment, the suffocating heat, the desperation. Jean shook his head, driving the memories away. There was no time for that now. Someone needed help, and he was the only one around. Approaching the mansion, the heat from the blaze hit him like a wall. The flames now engulfed almost the entire second floor, and Jean could hear the terrifying sounds of wood cracking and glass shattering. Then he saw her. Amidst the smoke and flames, Charlotte's pale, frightened face appeared at the second-floor window. Their eyes met for a brief moment, fear transforming into a glimmer of hope. Jean looked around frantically, searching for a way to reach her. His eyes landed on an old vine that climbed the mansion wall, reaching almost up to Charlotte's window. Without hesitation, Jean began to climb. The heat was intense, the smoke stung his lungs, but he kept going, driven by a force he didn't fully understand. "Hang on," he yelled to Charlotte. "I'm coming to help you." As Jean climbed, facing the heat and danger, Charlotte clung to the window, her eyes fixed on the small figure approaching. In that moment, two lonely lives were about to become entangled in a way neither of them could have predicted. The night that had started so quietly now roared with the flames of fate, about to change forever the lives of a brave homeless boy and a lonely rich girl. The roar of the flames tore through the night, accompanied by Charlotte's desperate screams. Jean, his heart hammering in his chest, looked at the burning mansion and then at the dark road leading away. For a brief moment, survival instincts screamed in his ears. "Run!" Save yourself! But then another cry cut through the air, weaker this time. Help! Please! Jean closed his eyes, his hands clenching into fists. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. Always help those in need, Jean. That's what makes us human. Taking a deep breath, Jean opened his eyes, determination shining in his gaze. Let's go, Max, he muttered to the dog, which barked in response. We have to help. Jean ran toward the mansion, the heat intensifying with every step. His eyes scanned the building's exterior for a way in. The vine he had noticed earlier seemed his best option. Without hesitating, Jean began to climb. His calloused hands gripped the twisted branches, while his bare feet searched for footholds on the rough wall. The heat was stifling, and the smoke made it hard to see, but he kept climbing, driven by urgency. Below, Max barked incessantly, as though encouraging his young friend. At last, Jean reached the second-floor window. The glass was hot to the touch, but not enough to burn him. With effort, he managed to open it and crawl into the burning room. The smoke was thick, forcing him to crouch low for cleaner air. "Charlotte," he called, coughing. "Where are you?" A weak moan guided him to a corner of the room. There, huddled and nearly unconscious, lay Charlotte. Her golden curls were streaked with soot, and her breathing was shallow and labored. Jean rushed over, placing a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "Charlotte, can you hear me?" "I've come to help." Charlotte's eyes opened slowly, filled with fear and confusion. Who are you?" she whispered between fits of coughing. "I'm Jean. I'm getting you out of here, okay? Trust me." Without waiting for an answer, Jean scooped Charlotte into his arms. Despite his slight frame, years of surviving on the streets had given him a surprising strength for his age. Holding Charlotte securely, Jean turned toward the door, only to find the flames already blocking the exit. Panic threatened to overwhelm him, but he pushed it away, forcing himself to think. "The window," he muttered. "We have to go back down the way I climbed." Carrying Charlotte, Jean returned to the window. The challenge now was to descend the vine with only one hand free. He knew it would be dangerous, but there was no other choice. "Charlotte, I need you to hold on to me as tight as you can, okay?" Jean instructed, positioning the girl on his back. Charlotte, semi-conscious, nodded weakly, wrapping her arms around Jean's neck. With one last look at the burning room, Jean began the perilous descent. Every movement was calculated, every step tested before placing his weight. Sweat streamed down his face, mixing with soot. Halfway down, a faint voice whispered in his ear. "I'm scared." "Me too," Jean admitted gently. "But we'll make it. I promise." As they neared the ground, a loud crash echoed above. Jean looked up to see part of the roof collapsing, sending a shower of sparks and debris toward them. "Hold on tight," he yelled, picking up speed. They were only a few feet from the ground when Jean's foot slipped. For one terrifying moment, they were falling. Jean twisted his body in midair, ensuring he took the brunt of the impact. They hit the ground hard, the force knocking the wind out of him, but Charlotte remained safe in his arms. Gasping for breath, Jean struggled to his feet, still cradling Charlotte. Max ran over, barking anxiously. "We're not safe yet," Jean panted. "We need to get farther away." As Jean carried Charlotte across the lawn, away from the burning mansion, he could hear sirens in the distance. Help was coming, but they still weren't out of danger. Suddenly, another explosion rocked the night, and Jean felt a searing pain in his leg. A piece of burning debris had struck him. Gritting his teeth, he kept moving. "Almost there," he encouraged Charlotte, who was stirring more in his arms. At last they reached the edge of the property. Jean gently placed Charlotte on the grass, collapsing beside her. Max whimpered, licking Jean's face in concern. Charlotte's eyes blinked, focusing on Jean's face. You saved me," she whispered. Jean managed a weak smile. "I couldn't leave you behind." As the sirens grew louder, Jean's vision began to blur. The last thing he saw before darkness overtook him was Charlotte's small hand reaching for his, a gesture of gratitude and connection that transcended their different worlds. In that moment, while the fire consumed the symbols of wealth and status behind them, two lonely souls found an unexpected bond. Jean, the resourceful orphan from the streets, and Charlotte, the isolated heiress, lay side by side on the grass, their destinies now intertwined by an extraordinary act of bravery. The night sky above them was painted in orange and red, a canvas of destruction. But amid the chaos, a spark of hope had been lit, one that would forever change both of their lives. When the first responders arrived, they found an unlikely trio. A young boy with ragged clothes reeking of smoke, a small girl in silk pajamas, soot staining her golden hair, and a loyal dog standing guard over them both. It was an image that would stay with them for years to come, a testament to the power of compassion and the indomitable spirit of youth. The heat was suffocating, the flames dancing menacingly around them. Jean, with Charlotte unconscious in his arms, looked frantically around for a way out. His heart pounded so hard it felt ready to burst from his chest. Without a second thought, Jean took off his tattered jacket and wrapped Charlotte in it. It offered little protection from the inferno surrounding them, but it was all he had to give. "It's going to be okay," he muttered, more to himself than to the unconscious girl. "We'll get out of here." Outside, Max's frantic barks echoed through the night. Jean approached a window trying to spot his faithful companion. Through the thick smoke, he saw Max running back and forth, barking insistently toward one corner of the house. "Good boy, Max!" Jean shouted, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "We're coming!" Guided by Max's barks, Jean moved carefully through the burning corridors. The floor creaked dangerously beneath his feet, and he could feel the intense heat through his worn-out soles. Finally, they reached a window at the end of the hallway. Jean looked down and saw the old vine extending to the ground. It was their only chance. With Charlotte clutched tightly in one arm, Jean opened the window. A blast of fresh air hit him, offering a momentary reprieve from the suffocating heat. But there was no time to savor it. "Hold on tight, Charlotte," he whispered, positioning the girl on his back. Even in her unconscious state, her arms instinctively tightened around his neck. With one final look at the hellish scene behind him, Jean began the dangerous descent. Each move tested his strength and balance. His muscles screamed in exhaustion, and fear threatened to paralyze him at every step. "Don't look down," he repeated to himself like a mantra. "Just one step at a time." Halfway down, a sudden crack above made Jean's heart skip a beat. He looked up to see part of the roof collapsing, sending a shower of burning debris their way. "No! No! No!" he shouted, speeding up his descent. Pieces of burning wood fell all around him, some perilously close. Fear threatened to consume him. His hands trembled, his feet slipped. For one harrowing moment, Jean thought they would fall. But then his mother's voice echoed in his mind. "You are stronger than you think, my son. Never give up." With a cry of determination, Jean found strength he never knew he had. Ignoring the pain and fatigue, he continued downward, inch by inch. When his feet finally touched the ground, Jean nearly collapsed in relief, but there was no time to rest. He could hear the wail of sirens approaching fast. Max ran over, barking and jumping in excitement. Jean offered a faint smile to his loyal friend, grateful for his constant presence. "Come on, boy," he said, starting to move away from the burning house. "We need to get Charlotte to safety." But every step was a struggle. Exhaustion weighed on Jean like a lead blanket. His vision began to blur, and he could feel his strength slipping away. That was when the first fire trucks arrived, their lights flashing urgently in the night. Paramedics leaped from the vehicles, racing toward the burning mansion. Jean hesitated. His street instinct screamed at him to run, vanish into the shadows as he always did, but Charlotte needed urgent medical help. With a heavy heart, Jean walked toward the paramedics. "Over here," he shouted, his voice raw and weak. "She needs help." The paramedics rushed over, immediately taking Charlotte from Jean's arms. "Good job, kid," one of them said, placing a reassuring hand on Jean's shoulder. "You saved her life." Dazed, Jean watched as they carried Charlotte to the ambulance. Part of him wanted to go with her, to make sure she'd be okay. But another part, the part that had kept him alive on the streets for so long, knew it was time to slip away. Seizing the confusion of the moment, firefighters battling the flames, paramedics caring for Charlotte, Jean quietly began to back away. Max, sensing his young master's intentions, followed silently. But before they could fully disappear, Jean stopped and looked back one last time. The sight of the burning mansion, the emergency vehicles, and the small figure of Charlotte being treated in the ambulance would be etched in his memory forever. "Goodbye, Charlotte," he whispered. "I hope you'll be okay." With those words, Jean and Max vanished into the darkness of the night, leaving behind chaos and destruction. The homeless boy who had become an unlikely hero went on his way, unaware that his life was about to change forever. As they made their escape, Jean felt a mix of emotions: relief at surviving, pride at having saved Charlotte, but also a twinge of sadness. For a brief moment, he had experienced a connection, a higher purpose than his daily struggle for survival. Exhausted and covered in soot, Jean finally reached his refuge in the old barn. Lying down in the hay with Max curled beside him, he at last allowed fatigue to claim him. Before drifting off, Jean looked at the stars visible through the cracks in the roof. "Mum," he whispered, "I hope you're proud of me." And with that thought, the little hero fell into a deep sleep, unaware of how his courageous actions had altered the course of many lives that fateful night. The ambulance sirens cut through the silence of the night as Charlotte was rushed to the hospital. Paramedics worked frantically, monitoring her vital signs and providing oxygen to ease her labored breathing. Not far behind, in another ambulance, lay Jean. The young hero had passed out soon after handing Charlotte over to medical care, succumbing to exhaustion and smoke inhalation. The paramedics, impressed by the boy's bravery, treated him with the same care and urgency. In the hospital, the emergency team waited, ready to receive the fire victims. When the ambulance doors opened, there was a flurry of doctors and nurses, taking Charlotte and Jean to separate treatment rooms. Meanwhile, Robert Miller received the phone call every parent fears. His face went pale upon hearing the words fire and Charlotte. Wasting no time, he sprinted out of his meeting, ignoring the confused protests of his investors. The drive to the hospital felt like an eternity for Robert. His mind was filled with horrible scenarios, and he blamed himself bitterly for not having been at home. "Please, God," he murmured repeatedly, "protect my daughter." Arriving at the hospital, Robert rushed to the reception desk, his usually composed demeanor completely undone. "Charlotte Miller," he gasped. "My daughter. Where is she?" The receptionist, recognizing the panic in his eyes, quickly directed him to the pediatric emergency wing. Robert ran through the corridors, his heart hammering in his chest. Finally, he spotted a doctor stepping out of one of the rooms. "Doctor," he called. "Charlotte Miller, how is she?" The doctor turned, his face serious but not alarmed. "Mr. Miller, your daughter is stable. She inhaled a significant amount of smoke and had an asthma attack, but she arrived here in time. We're treating her with oxygen and medication. She's going to be okay." Robert felt his legs nearly buckle with relief. He leaned against the wall, tears shining in his eyes. "Can I see her?" "Soon," the doctor assured him. "We're just finishing up some tests, but there's something else you need to know, Mr. Miller." Robert looked up, worried. "What?" "Your daughter didn't arrive here alone. She was rescued by a young boy who risked his own life to save her." Surprise registered on Robert's face. "A boy? Who?" "We don't know much about him," the doctor explained. "He appears to be homeless. He's being treated in another room. He inhaled a lot of smoke and is quite debilitated." Robert stood silent for a moment, processing the information. A homeless boy had saved his precious Charlotte. It seemed surreal. "May I see him?" Robert asked, surprising even himself with the request. The doctor nodded, guiding Robert to another treatment room. Entering, Robert felt his heart clench. Lying in the bed, looking even smaller and more fragile under the bright hospital lights, was Jean. The boy was unconscious, an oxygen tube in his nose, monitors beeping softly beside him. His skin was streaked with soot, and Robert could see minor burns on his arms and hands. "My God," Robert murmured, stepping closer to the bed. "He's so young." A nurse checking Jean's vitals glanced at Robert with a gentle smile. "He's a real hero," she said quietly. "The paramedics said he carried your daughter out of the burning house. He could barely stand when they arrived, but his only concern was making sure she was taken care of." Robert felt a wave of emotion crash over him, gratitude, admiration, and a profound sadness all at once. He looked at the frail boy in the bed, trying to imagine the courage and strength he must have had to pull off such a brave act. "Will he be okay?" Robert asked, his voice quavering. The nurse nodded. "Yes, he's strong. He'll need a few days to fully recover, but he'll be fine." Just then, Jean began to stir, his eyes fluttering open. Robert stepped closer, watching intently as the boy fought to regain consciousness. Jean's eyes finally opened, confused and disoriented. He looked around, panic growing in his gaze until it landed on Robert. "Charlotte," Jean managed, his voice raspy. "Is she—" "She's fine," Robert hurried to say, gently placing a hand on Jean's shoulder. "Thanks to you. You saved her life." Jean visibly relaxed, closing his eyes for a moment. When he reopened them, there was a mix of relief and apprehension. Robert felt an instant connection to the boy. Jean's genuine concern for Charlotte, even in his weakened state, touched something deep within Robert. "What's your name?" Robert asked softly. "Jean," the boy answered, hesitantly. "Jean," Robert repeated, a genuine smile spreading across his face for the first time that terrible night. "I'm Robert, Charlotte's father. And I have no words to thank you for what you did." Jean looked uncomfortable with the gratitude, averting his gaze. "Anyone would have done the same," he murmured. "No, Jean," Robert said firmly. "What you did was extraordinary. You are a hero." The words seemed to strike a chord in Jean, and Robert saw tears forming in the boy's eyes. On impulse, Robert extended his hand, gently holding Jean's. In that moment, a bond formed between the powerful businessman and the homeless boy. Robert felt a surge of protectiveness and gratitude he had never experienced before, except for Charlotte. "Rest now, Jean," Robert said softly. "You're safe here. And I promise I'll take care of you." As Jean drifted back into sleep, exhausted but at peace, Robert remained at his side, his mind churning with thoughts about the future and the changes this night would bring for them all. Morning sunlight filtered through the curtains of Jean's hospital room, casting a gentle glow on the boy as he slept. Robert entered quietly, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing an expression of fatigue. He hadn't slept, alternating between staying with Charlotte and checking on Jean all night. Sitting in the chair beside the bed, Robert studied the boy. In daylight, Jean's fragility was even more apparent. His ragged clothes had been replaced by a hospital gown, making him seem even smaller and more vulnerable. Jean began to stir, his eyes blinking slowly until they were fully open. For a moment, confusion flickered in his gaze until it settled on Robert. "Good morning, Jean," Robert said softly. "How are you feeling?" Jean sat up in bed, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "I'm okay," he replied hesitantly. "How's Charlotte?" Robert smiled, touched by the boy's genuine concern. "She's doing much better, thanks to you. In fact, she won't stop asking about her savior." A slight blush colored Jean's cheeks, and he looked away. Robert seized the moment to lean forward, his expression serious. "Jean, what you did was amazing. You risked your own life to save my daughter. I can never thank you enough." Jean looked even more uncomfortable with the praise. "I just did what anyone would do," he mumbled. Robert shook his head. "No, Jean, what you did was extraordinary. And I want to reward you for it." He pulled out a checkbook from his pocket, making Jean's eyes widen. "Name your price, anything you want. A new home, clothes, toys, whatever you wish." Silence stretched on for several seconds. Jean stared at the checkbook, clearly fighting an internal battle. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't need money, sir." Robert frowned, confused. But surely there's something you want, something we can do for you." Jean hesitated, biting his lower lip. Then, as if summoning courage, he looked Robert directly in the eyes. "My dog, Max, he's sick. If you could help him." Robert was stunned. Of all the things he expected to hear, this was not it. This boy, who had practically nothing, was turning down a fortune in favor of helping his sick dog. "Your dog?" Robert repeated, incredulous. Jean nodded, eyes shining with emotion. "He's my only friend. He's been coughing a lot lately and won't eat. I don't know what to do." In that moment, something shifted inside Robert. The simplicity and purity of Jean's request hit him like a lightning bolt. Here was a boy who had risked everything to save a stranger, and all he asked in return was help for his beloved dog. Robert felt a wave of shame. How many times had he ignored Charlotte's emotional needs in favor of material gains? How often had he measured the value of things only in monetary terms? "Jean," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion, "of course we'll help Max. I promise he'll get the best veterinary care available." Jean's face lit up with a genuine smile, the first Robert had seen. "Really? Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you so much." On impulse, Robert reached out and ruffled Jean's hair. "Don't thank me, kid. I should be thanking you 1,000 times over." Just then, a nurse entered the room. "Mr. Miller, your daughter is asking for you, and she insists on seeing the boy hero." Robert glanced at Jean, who looked both anxious and hopeful. "What do you say, John? Feel well enough for a visit?" John nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, please." Minutes later, Charlotte was brought in, sitting in a wheelchair. Her eyes lit up the moment she saw Jean, and a radiant smile spread across her face. "It's you," she exclaimed. "You saved me." John blushed again, but he smiled back. "Hey, Charlotte. I'm glad you're okay." The children started talking, Charlotte bombarding Jean with questions about how he rescued her, about his dog, about his life. Robert watched in awe at the instant connection between them. While the children chatted, Robert found himself making an impulsive decision, one that felt deeply right. "Jean," he said, gently interrupting their conversation, "I'd like to invite you. Once you and Charlotte are discharged, I'd like you to come stay with us for a while. We can take care of you and Max, give you a comfortable place to fully recover." The silence that followed was deafening. Jean stared at Robert with a mix of shock and distrust, clearly unable to believe what he was hearing. I don't know," Jean began, but Charlotte interrupted him. "Oh, please, Jean, please come. We can play together, and I can show you all my toys, and we can take care of Max together." Charlotte's enthusiasm was infectious, and Robert saw a glimmer of hope in Jean's eyes. "You can trust us, Jean," Robert said softly. "Let us give back even a little of what you did for our family." Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Jean nodded. "Okay," he whispered. "Thank you." In that moment, as Charlotte clapped happily and Robert felt a weight lifted from his shoulders, they all knew their lives had changed forever. A new family was taking shape, born from the ashes of a tragedy and united by the courageous act of a streetwise boy. The soft purr of Robert's luxury car was the only sound breaking the tense silence. In the back seat, Max, Jean's loyal companion, lay down, his breathing labored and eyes tired. Robert glanced in the rearview mirror, a mix of worry and determination on his face. "Don't worry, Max," he murmured, more to himself than to the dog. "We'll take care of you." Pulling up to the most renowned veterinary clinic in the city, Robert carefully carried Max inside. The veterinarian, Dr. Thompson, saw them immediately, having been alerted to the urgency of the case. While Max was examined, Robert couldn't help but think of Jean, alone in the hospital. The boy had been reluctant to part with his furry friend, but Robert's promise to personally care for Max had reassured him somewhat. "Mr. Miller, Doctor." Thompson's voice brought him back to reality. "Max has a severe case of pneumonia, probably due to malnutrition and exposure, but with proper treatment, he should make a full recovery." Robert exhaled in relief. "Do whatever it takes, Doctor. Cost is no object." Back at the hospital, Robert found a scene that warmed his heart. Charlotte, still in her wheelchair, was sitting beside John's bed. They were talking animatedly, laughing like old friends. "Daddy!" Charlotte exclaimed upon seeing him. "John was telling me about his adventures in the old barn. Can we have a barn too?" Robert chuckled, affectionately ruffling his daughter's hair. "We'll see, Princess." Turning to Jean, he smiled. "I have good news about Max. He's going to be fine." The relief on Jean's face was palpable. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. I don't know how to thank you." At that moment, Dr. Ramirez, Jean's physician, entered the room, his expression serious. "Mr. Miller, may I speak with you in private?" Out in the hallway, the doctor got straight to the point. "Mr. Miller, we're very concerned about Jean's condition. Besides the injuries from the fire, he shows signs of severe malnutrition and possible abuse. He has almost no medical history. This boy needs ongoing care and a stable environment." Robert felt his heart tighten. The image of the brave boy who had saved his daughter, living on the streets, hungry and cold, was unbearable. "Dr. May," Robert said firmly, "I'll do whatever it takes to ensure Jean gets all the care he needs. He will not go back to the streets." Returning to the room, Robert watched Jean and Charlotte chatting, lost in their own little world. His heart was already set on a course of action, but he knew convincing Jean wouldn't be easy. "Jean," he called softly, taking a seat on the edge of the bed, "remember the invitation I gave you to stay with us for a while?" Jane nodded, a flicker of apprehension passing through his eyes. "Well, I'd like to extend that invitation, not just for a few weeks, but for as long as you want." The silence that followed was almost palpable. Jean looked at Robert, his eyes brimming with both hope and fear. "But why?" Jean finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Robert took a deep breath. "Because you deserve a home, Jean, a safe place with warm meals, a comfortable bed, and people who care about you. And because I care about you." Charlotte, who had been listening in silence, suddenly clapped her hands in excitement. "Does that mean John will be my brother?" Charlotte's innocent question brought tears to Robert's eyes. "Only if he wants to, Princess. Only if he wants to." June seemed to be waging an internal battle. Years of surviving on the streets had taught him caution, not to trust easily. But the warmth and sincerity in Robert's eyes and Charlotte's pure enthusiasm were melting his defenses. Can I think about it?" Jean asked hesitantly. Robert nodded understandingly. "Of course, Jean. Take all the time you need." In the days that followed, as John and Charlotte recovered, Robert made all the necessary arrangements. A room was prepared for Jean in the mansion. New clothes were purchased, and appointments with the best doctors and therapists were scheduled. One day, while visiting Jean, Robert noticed an old, battered backpack in the corner of the room. It was the only item Jean had brought with him from the barn. "What's in there, Jean?" Robert asked curiously. Jean glanced at the backpack, a mix of protectiveness and nostalgia in his eyes. "They're just my things, important things." Robert nodded, respecting the boy's privacy. But he couldn't help wondering what treasures that worn backpack might hold, what stories it might tell about Jean's life. Finally, discharge day arrived. Jean, still hesitant but visibly healthier, stood by his bed, the old backpack slung over his shoulder. "Ready?" Robert asked gently. Jean looked at Charlotte, smiling encouragingly from her wheelchair, then back at Robert. Slowly, he nodded. "Yes," he said softly. "I'm ready." As they left the hospital, Jean to his new life and Charlotte to continue her recovery at home, Robert couldn't help feeling they were at the start of an incredible journey. A journey of healing, not just for Jean and Charlotte, but for himself as well. With Max waiting for them at home, recovered and eager to see his young owner, the new and unlikely family embarked on their journey together, toward a future full of promise and possibility. The gates of the Miller mansion opened, revealing a whole new world to Jean. His wide eyes took in the meticulously tended gardens, the ornate fountain, and the mansion's imposing facade. Max, now healthy and full of energy, barked excitedly beside him. "Welcome to your new home, Jean," Robert said, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. Jean swallowed hard, gripping the strap of his old backpack. It's so big," he murmured, clearly intimidated. Charlotte, seated in the back seat of the car, clapped her hands in excitement. "Come on, Jean, I want to show you everything." Entering the mansion, Jean was immediately enveloped by luxury, crystal chandeliers, Persian rugs, antique furniture, all so different from the abandoned barn he was used to. His bare feet hesitated on the gleaming marble floor. Anna, the housekeeper, greeted them with a warm smile. "Welcome, Jean. Your room is ready." Climbing the stairs, Jean was shown to a bedroom larger than any space he had ever lived in. A king-size bed, a flat-screen TV, a wardrobe full of new clothes. "Is all this for me?" Jean asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Robert nodded, smiling. "All yours, Jean. I hope you'll be comfortable." That night, Jean couldn't sleep. The bed was too soft, the room too quiet. He found himself staring out the window, longing for the familiar discomfort of the barn. Max, sensing his owner's restlessness, jumped onto the bed and curled up beside him, offering comfort. The days that followed were a whirlwind of new experiences. Jean struggled to adapt to scheduled mealtimes, hesitated to use the luxurious bathrooms, and felt out of place wearing the new, expensive clothes. Charlotte, on the other hand, flourished with her new friend's presence. Her health visibly improved, and her smiles became more frequent. She dragged John all around the mansion, showing off her toys, her favorite spots, filling the halls with laughter that hadn't been heard for a long time. Watching the transformation in his daughter, Robert began to reevaluate his priorities. He cancelled business trips, delegated more responsibilities, and started spending more time at home. Evenings were now filled with board games, reading sessions, and lively conversations around the dinner table. Not everything was easy, however. Some of the mansion's staff looked at Jean with distrust. Whispers and sideways glances followed him in the corridors. One day, Jean accidentally overheard a conversation between two employees. "Have you seen the way he eats? Like the food will disappear any second. And that old backpack, I bet it's full of stolen goods." Jean felt his face burn with shame and anger. He hurried back to his room, clutching his precious backpack. For a moment, he considered running away, returning to the streets where at least he knew his place. It was Charlotte who found him, huddled in a corner of the room, hugging his backpack. "Jean, what happened?" she asked, her voice full of concern. Jean hesitated, but something in Charlotte's genuine worry made him open up. He told her about the comments he'd overheard, about how out of place he felt. Charlotte listened intently, tears welling in her eyes. Without a word, she sat beside Jean and hugged him tight. "You're my hero, Jean," she whispered. "Don't let anyone make you feel less than that." That night, at dinner, Charlotte surprised everyone by confronting the adults about the way Jean was being treated. "Jean saved my life," she declared, her voice trembling slightly but determined. "He deserves to be here just as much as any of us." Robert, shocked by the revelation, took immediate action. He gathered all the staff, making it clear that Jean was now part of the family and should be treated as such. Gradually, things began to change. Encouraged by Charlotte and Robert's support, Jean started to open up more. He shared stories of his life on the streets, taught Charlotte some survival tricks he had learned, and slowly began to accept that maybe, just maybe, he truly belonged there. Jean's old backpack, however, remained a mystery. He guarded it zealously, never letting it out of his sight. Robert and Charlotte respected his privacy, though they couldn't help wondering what it contained that was so precious to the boy. One day, while they were playing in the garden, Charlotte had an asthma attack. Jean, without hesitation, ran inside and returned with her inhaler, which she had forgotten. "How did you know where it was?" Robert asked, impressed. Jean shrugged, a small smile on his lips. "I pay attention. Out on the streets, watching and remembering can save your life." In that moment, Robert truly realized all that Jean had been through and how resilient he was. As the weeks passed, the signs of Charlotte's improvement became more and more evident. Her complexion gained color, her energy increased, and her asthma attacks grew less frequent. The doctors were amazed by her progress. "It's because of Jean," Charlotte declared at one appointment. "He makes me want to be stronger." Hearing this, Jean felt something warm and comforting fill his chest. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to think that maybe, just maybe, he had found a real home. That night, as everyone prepared for bed, Jean looked at his old backpack. With a sigh, he opened it and pulled out a small, worn book, the only one his mother had given him before she died. Maybe, he thought, one day I can share this with them. And with that thought, Jean fell asleep. Max curled at his feet, feeling truly safe for the first time in years. The full moon hovered over the Miller mansion, casting restless shadows through the silent corridors. In Jean's room, another storm was brewing, a tempest of long-buried memories and fears. Jean tossed and turned in his bed, trapped in another of his recurring nightmares. In his dream, he was back in the small apartment he had shared with his mother. The acrid smell of smoke filled the air, flames dancing menacingly along the walls. "Mom!" he shouted desperately. But his voice was swallowed by the roar of the fire. The intense heat, the paralyzing fear, it all felt so real. Jean woke with a start, heart hammering against his ribs. His wide eyes scanned the room, momentarily confused by the luxurious decor that still felt so unfamiliar. Max, sensing his owner's distress, moved closer, offering comfort with his silent presence. The boy buried his face in the dog's fur, trying to steady his ragged breathing. Across the hall, Robert, who made his usual nighttime rounds to check on the children, heard the muffled sounds from Jean's room. Concerned, he approached and knocked softly on the door. "Jean? Are you all right in there?" There was a moment of silence before Jean's trembling voice answered, "Yes, Mr. Miller, I'm fine. Just a bad dream." Robert hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. Part of him wanted to go in and comfort the boy, but he respected Jean's privacy. "If you need anything, I'm here, okay?" "Thank you," came the soft, almost inaudible reply. The next morning at breakfast, Robert watched Jean closely. The boy seemed tired, with dark circles under his eyes that stood out starkly against his pale skin. But it wasn't just the fatigue that caught Robert's attention. There was something in the way Jean held his cup, in how he tilted his head slightly when thinking, that felt strangely familiar, an echo of someone he had once known. "Jean," Robert began casually, trying not to sound too intrusive. "Do you remember anything about your parents, about your life before coming here?" Jean's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. His eyes flicked to Robert's before shifting away. "Not much," he mumbled, pushing the food around on his plate. "Just my mom, a little." Charlotte, always sensitive to others' moods, sensed the tension. "Jean," she intervened quickly, "let's go play in the garden after breakfast. Max looks eager to run around." Grateful for the distraction, Jean nodded enthusiastically. The subject was dropped, but Robert's curiosity was far from satisfied. Later that day, Anne, the housekeeper, was tidying Jean's room when she noticed the old backpack carefully tucked under the bed. Intrigued by how carefully it was placed, she picked it up, surprised by its weight. Something inside felt solid, like a book or a box. Before she could investigate further, the sound of hurried footsteps alerted her. Jean entered the room, his eyes immediately landing on the backpack in Anne's hands. Panic was clear on his face. "Please," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "don't touch that. It's really important to me." Anne, realizing how precious the item was to the boy, gently replaced the backpack. "I'm sorry, Jean. I didn't mean to pry. I was just tidying up." Jean relaxed a bit, but his gaze never left the backpack until Anne left the room. Once the door closed, he rushed to check if everything inside was still intact. In the garden, Charlotte watched Jean playing with Max. She noticed how, from time to time, her friend seemed lost in thought, a shadow of sadness passing over his eyes. It was a stark contrast to those genuine moments of joy when he ran and laughed with the dog. "Jean," she asked softly, approaching him, Why do you get sad sometimes? Aren't you happy here with us? The question took Jean by surprise. He looked at Charlotte, touched by her perceptiveness. For a moment, he considered telling her everything about his mother, the fire, his lonely life on the streets. But the fear of losing it all made him hesitate. "I am happy, Charlotte, very happy," he reassured her, forcing a smile. "Sometimes I just miss things from before." Charlotte frowned, not entirely satisfied with the answer, but sensing she shouldn't push. Instead, she took Jean's hand. "Well, whenever you feel sad, remember you have me and Daddy now, and Max, of course." That evening, Robert decided to try once more. He found Jean in the library, engrossed in an adventure novel. "That used to be my favorite when I was your age," Robert commented, sitting beside the boy. "Jim Hawkins's adventures always made me dream of hidden treasures and mysterious islands." Jean smiled timidly. "It's really exciting. I like how Jim is brave, even though he's so young." Robert saw an opportunity. "You remind me a bit of Jim, you know, brave, resilient. You must have had many adventures of your own before coming here." Jean's smile faltered. Robert, noting the change, continued gently. "Jean, I know it must be hard talking about your past, but I want you to know you can trust us. Nothing you say will change the fact that you're part of this family now." Tears welled up in Jean's eyes, which he fought hard to hold back. Part of him desperately wanted to trust, to share the burden he carried. But another part, the part that had kept him alive on the streets, screamed to keep his secrets. I can't," he finally whispered, closing the book and standing abruptly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Miller. Good night." Robert watched the boy leave in a hurry, feeling a mix of concern and frustration. What could be so terrible that Jean was afraid to share? In the days that followed, Jean felt the weight of his secret more than ever. He saw the worry in Robert's eyes, Charlotte's curiosity, even Anne's puzzled looks. He felt he was disappointing the very people who had opened their arms to him. One night, after another particularly intense nightmare, Jean made a drastic decision. He couldn't go on like this. The fear of losing everything, of having his past exposed, was too great. Silently, he grabbed his precious backpack and began filling it with a few clothes. His plan was simple: leave before sunrise, return to the streets where no one asked questions, where his secrets would be safe. Heart heavy, Jean opened the bedroom door, ready to leave behind the comfort and affection he had experienced these past months. But as he stepped into the hallway, a soft voice froze him in place. "Jean, what are you doing?" Turning slowly, Jean found himself face to face with Charlotte, standing outside her room, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. In that instant, looking at the worried face of the girl who considered him a hero, Jean felt all his resolve crumble. The tears he had been fighting finally fell. I can't stay, Charlotte," he sobbed. "There are things about me, about my past." Charlotte stepped closer, clasping Jean's hand firmly. "It doesn't matter what they are, Jean. You're my friend, my hero. Nothing will change that." The simple yet heartfelt words from Charlotte struck Jean like a bolt of lightning. All the fears, all the doubts he had harbored for so long seemed insignificant in the face of this small girl's unwavering trust. "Okay," he finally said, his voice barely audible. "I'll stay, and I'll tell everything." Charlotte hugged him tight, relieved. "Let's wake Daddy, he'll want to hear it too." Hand in hand, they walked toward Robert's bedroom. Jean felt a mixture of fear and relief. He had no idea how Robert would react to the truth, but he knew he couldn't carry this burden alone any longer. With his hand on Robert's door handle, Jean took a deep breath. It was time to face his past and perhaps find a real future with the family that had welcomed him so warmly. The storm outside raged around the Miller mansion, lightning illuminating the night sky in dramatic flashes. Inside Jean's room, another storm was raging, a tempest of long suppressed memories and fears. Jean tossed and turned in bed, caught in the most vivid nightmare yet. He was back on that fateful day of the fire. The choking heat, the thick smoke obscuring his vision, his mother's desperate screams echoing in his ears. "Jean, the letter! Remember the letter?" The boy woke with a scream, bolting upright in bed, heart pounding wildly. Tears streamed down his face as he tried to orient himself, to distinguish dream from reality. The bedroom door opened, revealing a concerned Robert. He had heard Jean's cry and rushed to see what was happening. "Jean, are you all right?" Robert asked, moving cautiously closer. Disoriented and frightened, Jean couldn't hold back the sobs escaping his chest. Robert, driven by a paternal instinct, sat on the edge of the bed and, hesitantly, pulled Jean into a comforting embrace. To his surprise, Jean didn't resist. Instead, he clung to Robert as though his life depended on it, letting the tears flow freely. "Shh, it's all right now," Robert murmured, rubbing the boy's back. "You're safe here." Gradually, Jean's sobs subsided. When he finally calmed down, he pulled away slightly, wiping his face on the back of his hands. "I'm sorry," he muttered, avoiding Robert's gaze. "There's nothing to be sorry about, Jean," Robert replied gently. "We all have nightmares sometimes. Want to talk about it?" Jean hesitated, biting his lower lip. His eyes wandered the room, finally landing on his old backpack. Something within him seemed to resolve. "Actually," he said slowly, "there's something I need to show you." Robert watched, intrigued, as Jean grabbed the backpack and returned to the bed. The boy clutched it for a moment, as though summoning courage. "This backpack," Jean began, his voice trembling slightly, "is all that's left of my old life. Of my mom." With shaky hands, Jean opened the backpack and pulled out a worn book, some photos, and finally, an envelope. "My mom gave me this before the fire," Jean explained, holding the envelope. "She said it was really important, that I should give it to my uncle if something happened to her." Robert's heart sped up. "Jean," he asked gently, "what was your mother's name?" "Claire," Jean answered, tears welling up again. "Claire Dubois." Robert's world seemed to freeze for a moment. Claire Dubois. The name echoed in his mind, stirring long-buried memories. With trembling hands, he took the envelope Jean offered. Opening it, a photo fell into his lap. In it, two young women smiled at the camera. Robert immediately recognized one of them as his late wife, Marie. The other, Claire, he whispered, touching the photo reverently. Jean watched, confused and anxious, as Robert read the letter with wide eyes. As Robert continued, his expression shifted from shock to disbelief, and finally to raw, profound emotion. When he finished, Robert looked at Jean as though seeing him for the first time. Tears streamed freely down Robert's face. "Jean," he said, his voice breaking, you're my nephew." Jean froze in shock. "What?" he asked, barely believing what he heard. Robert took a deep breath, trying to regain composure. "Claire was Marie's younger sister, my wife's sister. They had a falling out many years ago before you were born. I didn't even know Claire had a son." Memories flooded Robert's mind. Whispered conversations with Marie, mentions of a strained sister, the sorrow in his wife's eyes whenever the subject came up. "Marie always wanted to reconcile," Robert continued, mostly talking to himself, "but we never found Claire. And then Marie got sick and—" His voice faltered, emotions overwhelming him. Jean, still trying to process everything, approached Robert hesitantly. "So, you're my uncle?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. Robert nodded, a trembling smile forming on his lips. "Yes, Jean, I'm your uncle. And your family." In that moment, something broke inside Jean. All the fears, all the doubts he had carried for so long, dissolved into a sea of emotions. With a sob, he threw himself into Robert's arms, who held him tightly, both of them openly weeping. They stayed like that for a long time, uncle and nephew reconnecting after years of an unknown separation. When they finally pulled apart, Robert cupped Jean's face in his hands, studying every detail. "How did I not see it before?" he murmured. "You have Claire's eyes and Marie's smile." Jung smiled shyly, feeling truly seen for the first time in years. "What happened, Jean?" Robert asked gently. "How did you end up on the streets?" Jean took a deep breath, sensing it was time to share the full story. He spoke of the fire that took his mother's life, how he was left alone and scared, wandering from town to town, always afraid of being caught and sent to an orphanage. Robert listened, his heart breaking with each word. Guilt tore at him. If only he and Marie had searched harder, if only they'd insisted on finding Claire, maybe. "I'm so sorry, John," he said when the boy finished. "I'm sorry you went through all that alone. But now you have a home, a family." Jean nodded, silent tears running down his cheeks. "I always wanted a family," he confessed. "I always wanted to belong somewhere." "And you do belong, Jean," Robert assured him. "You belong here with us, with Charlotte, with me. This is your home now, forever." At that moment, as if she'd heard her name, Charlotte appeared at the door, rubbing sleepy eyes. "Daddy? Jean? What's going on?" she asked, noticing their tear-streaked faces. Robert held out his hand, beckoning Charlotte to join them on the bed. "Come here, Princess. We have some wonderful news to share." As Robert gently explained the situation to Charlotte, Jean watched, his heart filling with an emotion he could barely name. Gratitude? Joy? Love? Understanding that Jean was actually her cousin, Charlotte let out a delighted squeal and jumped on him with a big hug. "I knew you were special," she exclaimed. "Now you're really part of our family." Jean laughed, hugging Charlotte back, feeling truly at home for the first time in years. Robert watched them, his heart overflowing with love for these two children, his daughter and his newly discovered nephew. He knew there would be many discussions, many details to figure out, but in that moment, nothing else mattered, besides the fact that their family was complete. Outside, hardly the storm was dying down. The first rays of the rising sun broke through the clouds, as though nature itself was celebrating this long-awaited reunion. For Jean, it was like a massive weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He no longer had to carry his secrets alone. He didn't need to run or hide anymore. He was home, he had a family. And for the first time in a long while, Jean looked to the future not with fear but with hope and anticipation. Robert's world had indeed been turned upside down by this revelation, but it was a welcome upheaval, one that filled a void in his heart he hadn't even realized was there. While the newly reunited family embraced, laughing and crying all at once, Robert made a silent promise to Claire, to Marie, and to himself. He would care for Jean as if he were his own son. He would give the boy all the love, security, and opportunities he deserved. The future, once uncertain, now shone with endless possibilities. And together, as a family, they were ready to face it. The days following the revelation were tense in the Miller mansion. Robert, deeply shaken by the discovery that John was his nephew, locked himself away in his office. He spent hours poring over old family albums, rereading Claire's letter, trying to process the flood of emotions. Jean, meanwhile, interpreted Robert's withdrawal as rejection. The old fear he had carried for so long, that he wouldn't be accepted, that he would be abandoned again, resurfaced. Heart heavy, he began planning to run away, convinced that his presence was causing more pain than happiness. Charlotte, ever perceptive, noticed the growing distance between her father and her newly discovered cousin. She saw the sad look on Jean's face whenever Robert passed by without speaking, and she noticed how her father seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. One particularly gloomy afternoon, Charlotte decided it was time to act. She marched determinedly to her father's office and, without knocking, opened the door. Robert looked up, startled. "Charlotte, what is it, sweetheart?" The girl crossed her arms, wearing a stern expression on her young face. "Daddy, we need to talk about Jean." Robert sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. "Charlotte, it's complicated." "No, it isn't," she interrupted, her voice trembling slightly. "Jean is family. He saved us, and now you're making him feel like we don't want him here." Charlotte's words hit Robert like a punch to the stomach. He looked at his daughter, seeing not just the little girl he knew, but a reflection of Marie's compassion and strength. "Oh, Charlotte," he muttered, pulling her into a hug. "You're right. I messed up, didn't I?" Charlotte hugged her father back, feeling his tears dampen her hair. "Not yet, Daddy, but you need to talk to Jean. He thinks you don't want him here." Her words were a wake-up call to Robert. Suddenly, he saw clearly how his behavior must have seemed to Jean, a boy who had already lost so much, who had finally found a home only to feel he was being pushed away again. "Where's John now?" Robert asked, standing abruptly. Charlotte's face went pale. I saw him going to his room with that old backpack of his." "Dad, I think he might be planning to run away." Without wasting a second, Robert raced out of his office, taking the stairs 2 at a time. His heart pounded in his chest, fear of losing Jean, of failing him as he felt he had failed Claire, propelling him forward. He reached Jean's room just in time to see the boy opening the window, his old backpack slung over his shoulder. "Jean!" Robert shouted, making the boy freeze in place. "Please, don't go." Jean turned slowly, tears in his eyes. I thought you didn't want me here," he whispered. Robert crossed the room in a few quick strides, pulling Jean into a tight embrace. "Oh, Jean, forgive me. I never wanted you to feel that way. I was scared." Jean, tense at first, gradually relaxed in Robert's arms. "Scared? You?" Robert drew back a bit, keeping his hands on Jean's shoulders. His own eyes shone with unshed tears. "Scared I wouldn't be good enough for you. That I'd fail you like I failed your mother." Jean blinked in surprise. But you didn't fail her." "Oh, you didn't know?" "Exactly," Robert nodded sadly. "I didn't know, and it haunts me. If I'd tried harder, if I'd searched more for Claire, maybe you wouldn't have gone through all that." John fell silent for a moment, processing Robert's words. Then, to both their surprise, he gave a small smile. "You know, my mum used to say we can't change the past, but we can choose our future." Robert felt his heart swell with equal parts pride and sorrow. "Your mother was a wise woman," he said softly. "Jean, I'm so sorry I made you feel unwanted. Nothing could be further from the truth. Your family. You belong here with us." The tears Jean had been holding back finally flowed. "I'm so afraid," he confessed. "Afraid this is all too good to be true. That one day I'll wake up and it'll all have been a dream." Robert pulled Jean into another hug, his own voice thick with emotion. "It's not a dream, Jean, it's real. And I promise you, I'll be here every day to remind you of that. You'll never be alone again." At that moment, Charlotte slipped quietly into the room. Seeing her dad and Jean embracing, she ran over to join them, wrapping both in her small arms. There, in that family embrace, something shifted. The final barriers fell, the fears began to fade. It wasn't a perfect family. Wounds still needed healing, trust needed building. But it was a start. A new chapter was being written, brimming with promise and possibility. When they finally pulled apart, all of them red-eyed but smiling, Robert ruffled Jean's hair affectionately. "How about we start over?" he suggested. "No more secrets, no more fear. Just us, a family, facing the future together." Jean looked at Robert, then at Charlotte, and felt a wave of belonging unlike anything he'd ever known. With a genuine smile, he nodded. "I'd really like that," he answered. And so, on that sunny afternoon, a new journey began for the Miller family. A journey of healing, of love, and above all, of hope. In the months that followed, a remarkable transformation took place within the Miller household. Once quiet and formal, the mansion now echoed with laughter and lively conversation. Gradually, Jean left behind his fear and distrust, flourishing under the love and care of his new family. As for Robert, he rediscovered the joy of being a father. He spent more time at home, actively participating in Jean's and Charlotte's lives. Evenings were filled with board games, reading aloud, and long talks about the past, the present, and the future. One sunny summer morning, Robert awoke with a smile on his face. It was Jean's birthday, and he had planned a special surprise. With Charlotte's help, and the help of the household staff, he had organized a surprise party to celebrate not only John's birthday, but also a very important announcement. That afternoon, when Jean came downstairs, he was greeted by a burst of confetti and a chorus of surprise. His eyes widened at the sight of the room decked out with balloons and banners, and a huge cake in the center of the table. "Happy birthday, Jean!" Charlotte shouted, running over to hug her cousin. Overwhelmed, Jean looked around, seeing not just his family but also new friends he had made at school and around the neighborhood. Max, his loyal canine companion, barked happily at his side. Robert approached, placing a hand on Jean's shoulder. "Happy birthday, son," he said warmly. "But we have more than just your birthday to celebrate today." Jean looked curiously at his uncle. Robert signaled, and Anne, the housekeeper, brought over a large, ornate envelope. "Jean," Robert began, his voice thick with emotion, "these past few months have been the happiest of my life since I lost Marie. You've brought light back to this house, to our lives. And today I want to make official what we already feel in our hearts." He handed the envelope to Jean, whose hands trembled as he opened it. His eyes scanned the document, growing wide in realization. This is?" he stammered, hardly daring to believe. Robert nodded, tears in his eyes. "Yes, John, they're adoption papers. If you'll accept, you'll legally be my son." The room fell silent, everyone waiting anxiously for Jean's reply. The boy looked from the document to Robert, then to Charlotte, who smiled encouragingly. I don't know what to say," Jean finally managed, his voice shaking. "You've already given me so much. This family, it's the greatest gift I could ever ask for." He threw his arms around Robert, sobbing with happiness. "Yes," he whispered, "yes, I want to be your son." The room erupted in applause and cheers. Charlotte joined the embrace, forming a joyful, loving trio. When the initial wave of emotion subsided, Robert made another announcement. "To honor Claire's memory and help other children like Jean, we're creating the Claire Dubois Foundation. We'll work to get children off the streets and give them a chance at a better future." Still teary-eyed, Jean felt his heart fill with pride and gratitude. "Can I help?" he asked eagerly. "I want to make a difference for other kids like me." Robert smiled, proud.